Now, again, without any waste of time, let me take this amazing pleasure of welcoming our speaker this morning. He is not a beginner at this. He's done this a number of times, and every time he comes on, I think everybody just gets excited because of this touches at the heart and the core of who we are as a human. Now, Vincent is a retired company director, environmentalist, author, and a registered scientist. He has a keen interest in the Magaliesberg and the Cradle of Humankind. Vincent initiated a program to have the region declared an international biosphere reserve by the UNESCO. He has written and edited books, many articles, and 2 videos in the field of history and natural sciences. He was awarded at the University of the Witwatersrand Gold Medal for his work on South Africa's biological sciences, and received the Chancellor's Medal from Northwest University for his contribution to the environment. This is just a few among numerous accolades that he's received over his lifetime. He serves on the board of numerous environmental organizations and runs management consultancy. He was awarded the prestigious Stevenson-Hamilton Medal by the Zoological Society of Southern Africa for his contribution as a zoologist. So this is going to be absolutely amazing. What an absolute pleasure to have you here, Sir Vincent. I don't want to waste too much time. I want to just give it up to you now, and to everybody else, I will be catching up with you at the end on the other side of the call. So, Sir Vincent, please take it away, sir.
Thank you very much, John. That's very kind and a warm welcome, and hello everybody who has joined us. The Magaliesberg range is a low range of mountains, but it lies between Pretoria and Rustenburg. And my first introduction to this region was on a farm called Windhover, which looks like this. This is the view looking down onto the Olifantsneck Dam. And we hadn't been there very long. I'm talking about going out there first about 40 years ago. And we hadn't been there very long before I realized that this was more than just a pretty view. There was an enormous amount of history and heritage and natural history in the region. In the view that we're looking at now down by the dam, there was a huge battle fought during the South African War. In the same spot, there was 14 years later, this was the place where the 1914 rebellion broke out. Also just on the banks of the dam, which then of course didn't exist. That was just a valley at that stage. And through that valley in 1900, General de Wet led the Boer Army, the Free State Boer Army, with the president of the Free State, President Steyn, through that valley in what was probably the most famous of all great escapes in all military history. The whole army moved down that valley that you've just seen and escaped 40,000 British troops that were chasing them. And they got through, and they got through safely, and the war carried on after that. So there's an immense amount of history. Another thing that happened down there in the view that we were looking at was the naturalist and hunter William Cornwallis Harris found and described for science for the first time the sable antelope, which reaches its most southerly distribution at the Magaliesberg range, where he saw it and painted it. If you turn around and face in the other direction away from the dam that we were looking at, you see the great cliffs of the Magaliesberg rising up across the horizon. Geologically very interesting, and I'll be talking about them. And then in the foreground, there are ruins of the sprawling walled settlements of the Bakwena Modemesana, who were settled here over the last 500 years, and these ruins were left perhaps 200 years ago, and they lie all around the Magaliesberg in this particular part of it. Cornwallis Harris painted himself hiding behind those ruins in about 1835 or so, while he was hunting rhinoceros. And you can see that he made use of those same ruins. Then on top of the mountain, there are the old fortifications of the South African Wall. The big battle that I mentioned was fought there. And then at your feet, lying around as you stand on that farm, you will find dozens of these little microliths. They're Stone Age tools going back more than 1,000 years, probably a great deal more than 1,000 years. So this region is quite incredible in its scope of interest and heritage. But around you, there is the natural heritage at all, a wildlife display of two biomes that I'll be mentioning in a moment. So we get species from grassland and we get species from bushveld and woodland, all congregated in the Magaliesberg. So the wildflowers and the bird life and the game and so on is really quite incredible. The region that I'm talking about, because really my interest spread from that one farm where you saw all of that stuff a moment ago, it then spread out across the entire Magaliesberg region. And you can see the Magaliesberg Biosphere Reserve now, which is the colored part of this map, lying between Pretoria and Rustenburg. The core areas are the Magaliesberg Protected Environment, which is the mountain range itself, and the Cradle of Humankind, which is in Gauteng. One is in Northwest Province, the other is in Gauteng. And those are the two cores of this region. And all around them are the conservancies and the farmers who have placed their farms under the auspices of the Biosphere Reserve and make it a very, very precious place indeed, historically and from a point of view of natural interest. And that is the landscape that I have, and the long story that I have tried to tell in this book, The Cradle of Life. It's an amazing place in that in this landscape, the whole story of life, from the very beginnings of our earliest concepts of how life might have began on the planet, right through until the modern era, there is a continuous thread of a story. And I'm going to trace a little bit of that in the course of this talk. And I have tried to do so in the book at greater length. Now, it's often said that the Magaliesberg is the oldest mountain range in the world. That's not strictly true. It isn't, because mountains disappear, they erode away. And perhaps the oldest mountain range is at the Limpopo Valley. It's disappeared altogether and it's become a flatland. But we are sited, the Magaliesberg is sited on the oldest block of dry land that emerged from seismic activity perhaps 3.5 billion years ago. So the landscape on which it is very, very old. The mountains itself are also old. They're more than 2 billion years old. And as we go through this talk, we'll be following that time scale from historical time, which I'm really talking about written history, which goes back about 200 years in this part of the world. We'll talk about archaeological time, which is measured in thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, and the instruments we use are artifacts that are left in the field after the people have disappeared. Then we'll move into paleontological time, which is really dealt with in millions of years. And that's the time of the fossils and the fossil caves and so on. And then we'll go even deeper into what I'm calling geological, what is called geological time, which talks about billions of years ago when the mountains themselves were formed. And that's where I think we should start, right at the very beginning in deep geological time. And when we look at the mountains, the Magaliesberg range, you'll see a very strange shape, actually. The northern side, which is the left-hand side of your picture, is a gradual slope dipping down into the valley on that side. And on the southern side, there is an abrupt cliff face dropping quite sharply into the valley here. And that tells us a story. It tells us how these mountains came about. Because once upon a time, they were part of a great big dome that stretched right over the landscape, probably for about 40 or 50 kilometers to the south. And what we're looking at now is the remnants of that dome that has eroded away and left just the edges of the dome around the perimeter. I always think of it a bit like a hard-boiled egg that you've chopped the top off. And these are the little jagged eggshells around the egg, and you're about to dip your spoon into the middle of it and eat the inside. So think of it as the rim of an old dome or an old boiled egg. Now, the eggshell formed between 2 and 2.5 billion years ago from sand and mud and dolomite settling down on the bottom of a shallow sea and concretizing into a rock base that was based there. And then about 2.1 billion years ago, the mantle of the Earth, the inner part of the Earth's, below the Earth's crust, thrust up huge amounts of pressure. And that, on the right-hand side of your screen, pushed up what they call a plume, and that created the dome or the boiled egg. On the left-hand side of your screen, it actually broke through the sediments and created the Bushveld complex. And that spread magma and lava and under huge boiling temperatures and pressures into the Magaliesberg sediments and deposited a vast amount of platinum and other minerals around the edge. Nobody is quite sure why that deposit is caused, but it was part of the process of the Bushveld complex. And that Bushveld complex is world-renowned as a very unique lopolith process that has taken place here on a grander scale than anywhere else on the planet. Then from 2 billion years ago until the present, the dome eroded away into what eventually became the shape of the mountains that we know today and that I showed you in the earlier photograph. So that is how the mountain range became created. Bushveld igneous molten lava flowed into the cracks and the crevices of the dome and the eggshell, and it formed huge kloofs. It actually melted out deep kloofs, which are spectacular scenically. They're the thrill of the mountain club who go climbing in them. And they're a wonderful place where the climate is benign because it's sheltered within the kloofs. And it really is a spectacular part of the whole mountain range. And around the edges, the hot lava actually melted the quartzites, those sediments, and turned them and then recrystallized them into quartzite. And some of the quartzite is so grossly recrystallized into large crystals that it weathers away into these incredible shapes all over the mountainside. And if you've got a good quality screen, you might actually see at the bottom of this mushroom here, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Next. Look at the bottom of this mushroom, and you will see perhaps these white little crystals of quartzite that have weathered away from the rock. And they form little pools of crystalline gravel. And in that gravel, an absolutely unique plant has adapted to that environment. It's called Frithia pulchra, and it grows only there in that gravel that is formed from the recrystallized quartzite and nowhere else in the world. And you find it there. You generally can't even see it because its leaves look so much like the crystals of quartzite. But when it flowers, it has this very pretty little pink thing and is quite spectacular on the otherwise quite dry, bare felt. Now, what about the layer of dolomite? I talked about the mud and the shale, and that's turned into quartzite now. But the dolomite formed in a very different way. Dolomite is the product of a bacteria, a special bacteria called cyanobacteria that had evolved 3 billion years ago the ability to photosynthesize and to grow itself in successive layers of the bacteria itself, and then it deposited calcium carbonate, or what's more commonly known as limestone, in one layer upon another as it developed throughout its life. And these great big domes exist all over what is now the cradle of humankind in the Magaliesberg Biosphere. At the same time as forming calcium carbonate, the cyanobacteria exuded oxygen, and the oxygen didn't go into the air straight away. It actually rusted and formed iron oxide from all the iron that was round and about, and only then, after many millions of years, was it released into the atmosphere, where it changed the whole direction of the evolution of life. And of course, we breathe oxygen now and we're utterly dependent on it. And every molecule of oxygen that we breathe has actually come through a plant, which is the succession to the cyanobacteria, and has been created by photosynthesis. Now, those layers of calcium carbonate are still visible. They're 2 billion-year-old fossils in the cradle of humankind. That means they are 1,000 times older than the hominin fossils, the human ancestor fossils that we see there. The old stromatolites, as they're called, are that age, and they formed the basis of the dolomite. They turned into dolomite eventually. So we'll shift now from geological time, do a quantum leap in time to paleontological time, and look at some of the fossilization process that had taken place. And the time that has elapsed in this great big quantum leap that I've made has seen some massive changes. One of the things is that the Karpvaal Craton, that old block of land on which the Magaliesberg was originally formed, has now fused into other supercontinents. Other bits of land have joined it and then broken away again. And eventually the great supercontinent of Gondwana was formed, still with the Magaliesberg perched on top of it. But continental drift took Gondwana right down south under the South Pole. And there the polar ice scraped off the top of the Magaliesberg, so that from Pretoria to Rustenburg, the altitude of the Magaliesberg is pretty much the same. It's absolutely evenly shaved off by polar ice, which makes it so distinctive, such a distinctive level range of cliff faces that we see, all ending up at the same altitude. As Gondwana moved north, Africa didn't break away, but South America and Australia broke away from Africa, leaving Africa. And as it became warmer and more benign in its climate, as it got further from the South Pole, it was covered by forest. And the forest land was eventually, as things got even drier, replaced gradually by grassland. So we got a savanna of woodland and grassland. That all took place, and really what we have now is at the interface where the Magaliesberg is, we have the interface between the grassland, which is yellow, and the, pardon me, I must have another swig of water. I promise it's only water. And the savanna that stretches right up into Central Africa. And the Magaliesberg lies right at that interface. And that, as I mentioned a little earlier, is why we get such a variety of biodiversity. Plants and animals are drawn from both of those big biomes, some from grassland and some from the woodland or the savanna area. And sable antelope, incidentally, which I mentioned Cornwallis Harris describing, is a savanna species. It doesn't come, its natural distribution doesn't extend any further south than the Magaliesberg itself. And that makes the Magaliesberg biologically a very important place. Now, as that grassland moved and displaced the forest animals, most of them moved with the forest. They stayed within their own habitat, and they moved further and further towards the north and stayed in what is now the Congo and the Central African forests. Chimpanzees and gorillas are the typical example of those. But some of the primates didn't move with the forest. They actually adapted and evolved to be able to live in the grassland or on the savanna. And they did this by becoming first bipedal, so that they walked on their hind legs and could use their hands freely to manipulate things. And these are, of course, our ancestors, the hominin line. And there's probably, almost certainly, more than one species of them. Only one species of us has survived to this day. But at this time that I'm talking about, there were probably two or maybe more species of hominin that had managed to evolve to savanna and didn't have to remain with the forest. Now, the curious coincidence is that at the time that stage in our evolution was taking place, something else was happening underground. And that was that water was seeping into the dolomite. That was the limestone that had been created by bacteria, and dolomite rock that had formed is slightly soluble. So the water that seeped into it created these massive caverns, great big caverns filled with water. And just at the time that hominins were beginning to evolve, these caverns were exposed to the surface because the surface was eroding away, and these big underground caves were exposed through avons up to the daylight and into the open air. And when they were open to the surface, bits and pieces of debris and sand and mud and the odd unhappy animal fell into the cave down to the bottom. And in a dolomitic cave, there is what you might call the perfect laboratory for creating fossils, because the highly mineralized water fossilizes the bones, fossilizes the remnants, the skeletal remnants of the animals that fell in there. And then if you mix water and lime and stone and rocks, it forms, what do we know, concrete. And so the fossils, the bones that had been fossilized, were actually entombed in concrete. And that's a good thing, because that concrete, which is called breccia, preserves the bones and the fossils against decay and erosion and general damage, for paleontologists to find millions and millions of years later, and pretty well in a good state. They're actually preserved. They require an immense amount of effort to gradually take these fossils out of the breccia, because it's digging a fairly soft fossilized material out of a block of concrete. And here is Professor Ron Clark, who has excavated this one, the most famous of all of the fossils that have come out of the cradle of humankind, nicknamed Littlefoot. And here it took him 20 years to get that fossil free of the breccia, and we now have a complete fossil of one of the earliest of the hominins that are known on the planet, through this very meticulous work that Ron Clark did. Ron Clark will be talking to us at a symposium. The Heritage Association of South Africa has chosen the Magaliesberg this year to be the host place for its annual symposium. It's the first time it's ever come up into this part of the world. And one of the guest speakers is going to be Ron Clark, who'll be talking about this incredible discovery that he has made. Now, later on, those hominids spread from Africa right across the world, so that at different years, you can see the years when they reached various places on the planet, but every single human being in the world can say with certainty that they have an African ancestor, because from about 100,000 years ago, and actually probably a lot earlier than that, the hominins began to move out of Africa and spread everywhere and populate the world as we do now. So we'll move then to the time that human beings had become human beings, Homo sapiens. So we'll go from paleontological time to archaeological time, and now we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of years and looking at the actual artifacts that those humans left behind them. And the Magaliesberg is extraordinary in that the artifacts, certainly the stone tools that were made, date right through this period of development from 1 million or more years ago. In fact, Professor Kathy Kuhlman is finding stone tools that go back probably 2 million years old, but this is an axe that is certainly at least 1 million years old and found in the Magaliesberg. Later on, they had perfected the technology, and between 100 and 20,000 years ago, they were making finer and sharper tools. And it was this toolkit of that particular period, called the Middle Stone Age, that allowed the hominins to migrate, because these little tools gave them the ability to dominate different landscapes and different climatic areas, and to live under very different circumstances, because they could use these tools to help them to survive. And still in the Magaliesberg, you go right through to the little microliths, which are very similar to a small penknife that we use today, sharp little instruments. And I showed you one that was found on our farm, and there are lots of them all over the Magaliesberg. So we have, in this one region, in the Magaliesberg Biosphere Reserve, the whole spectrum of the development of Stone Age tools. Of course, they didn't only make stone tools, but stone tools are the ones that survive best, and we see them and find them most frequently. But by the later Stone Age, they were making bows and arrows and spears. They were making ornamental necklaces and out of ostrich eggshells and all sorts of things that they would have done. They certainly would have used wooden tools of some sort or another and spears and so on. So they were well equipped to handle their environment. And they also performed exquisite art. And the Magaliesberg rock art is not paintings. Most people think of rock art as rock paintings in caves. The rock art in the Magaliesberg is etched on exposed rock. They're not in caves, they're on boulders out in the open. And they're unique in that the artwork is done by a single stroke or just a few strokes, which enabled the artist to depict very accurately. This is clearly a young eland, and they did it with just a stroke. Now, most rock etchings are chipped. They're pecked out with some harder instrument, some harder stone. They would peck at it and create the drawing. Now, these ones are done by drawing that line, that extraordinary line, and we don't know how it was done, quite frankly. They must have been very talented at whatever skill they had to do this, and these are remarkable artworks that we find on the rocks in the Magaliesberg today. Those people that did all of that and had those tools were nomadic. They roamed around the Magaliesberg, but they were replaced about 300 or 400, in about 300 or 400 AD, in other words, 1600 years ago. They were replaced by people migrating back again. You remember, Homo sapiens has moved out across the world. Now some of them came back into this environment. They crossed over the Magaliesberg, and they brought with them a number of skills which changed the pattern of occupation altogether. One of the things they could do was husband cattle, husband domestic animals. So they didn't have to hunt every day for their protein. Their protein they kept domestically on foot. It also became the economic culture. The cattle economy was developed by these people, and cattle were currency as well as food and supplies of protein. They also brought the skill of smelting iron. And the reason they stopped in the Magaliesberg and settled there was that the mountains are rich in iron. And I mentioned why. When that oxygen was released by the cyanobacteria 2 billion years ago, it created enormous deposits of iron ore. And these people managed to excavate that iron ore and create spears and tools for farming and generally improve their ability to handle the environment with iron equipment. And if you go to the rocks in parts of the Magaliesberg, this is just outside Broederstroom, where the earliest of those sites is, you'll find that a fridge magnet will actually stick to the rock. It is so rich in iron. And that is why the people settled there first, along the Crocodile River Valley. That earliest settlement of about 300 AD or 350 AD was first found by a man called Arno van Gendering. Professor van Gendering was actually an astronomer with the Leiden University. Leiden University in those days, this is in the 1970s, they had an observatory on the banks of the Hartbeespoort Dam. And van Gendering worked in the observatory, but he was also a bit of an amateur archaeologist, and he noticed all these pot shards and iron instruments and stuff lying around his observatory. He spoke to Revel Mason, who was the doyen of the archaeologists in the Magaliesberg at the time in the 1970s. This is van Gendering's telescope, which is still there, incidentally. It belongs now to the Technical University of the Tshwane University of Technology. And it's in their care, and we're hoping that we'll be able to resuscitate these telescopes one day and let the public go and visit them. But van Gendering told Revel Mason about the site, and he excavated it. And most of what we know about these very early Iron Age people comes from this site, where their activity was revealed by Revel Mason's exploitations. Later on, those same people stayed in the Magaliesberg, and they developed huge towns. Eventually, by about the end of the 18th century, they were building massive cities and huge settlements in stone walling, and they kept their cattle culture was still intact. And they are, of course, the ancestors of the modern Botswana, who are the people who live in the Magaliesberg. And you saw their walls earlier, the ruined walls of their settlements. And there are really some very exquisite examples of this all over the landscape. But they were conquered by the Ndebele king, Mzilikazi, in 1827. Mzilikazi was a refugee from King Shaka in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, and he came up with an army, and he, after quite a long period of wandering through the what is now Mpumalanga province, he reached the Magaliesberg, and his armies swept through the Magaliesberg. This is a map before anybody had developed anything there. He came up where the red arrows go, and at each of the Morofi, the groups of Botswana people who were living there, he conquered and subjugated them all the way around the entire Magaliesberg. And he had a kingdom that stretched not only from the Magaliesberg, where he had his headquarters, but right down to the Vaal River in the south and up to the Limpopo River in the north. That was the territory that he conquered from 1827. And he was there for only a decade, but he changed the whole pattern of lifestyle in this region. Here you see a painting done by Charles Bell, who visited on one of the expeditions into Mzilikazi's territory, and Bell came in about 1836. And you'll see the Ndebele guards, who are the feathered guys with shields and spears, shepherding or herding Bakwena people who were taking tribute to King Mzilikazi in the Magaliesberg, where he was based. So we'll go from archaeological time into historical time now, because during that 10-year period that Mzilikazi was king of the region, people came, at least not historians, but missionaries and traders and explorers and hunters, and one of them was William Cornwallis Harris that I've spoken about. They all came into this region, and we have very accurate written history now of the region and how it developed. One of the most prominent of them was Robert Moffat. Moffat was a missionary at Kuruman, and he was almost summoned by Mzilikazi to come and talk to him and form a friendship which actually lasted for the next 40 years. They were lifelong friends, Robert Moffat and King Mzilikazi. And because of that friendship, Robert Moffat was able to allow people to come into the kingdom as long as they came through his mission station. Mzilikazi was happy to see them. And so we get people, explorers and painters and writers, coming through with the blessing of Mzilikazi. And this is another of Charles Bell's paintings. This one is of the Hartbeespoort before there was a dam there. And you can see what a dramatic sight it was. He painted extensively. He came up with an expedition led by Andrew Smith. And the large expedition went up to visit Mzilikazi and recorded everything that was going on. And they recorded the social life, and they recorded the landscape and all of the enormous variety of fauna and flora that there was in the region. Now, that gorge was eventually blocked by the Hartbeespoort Dam, and that has changed the pattern of the whole area quite considerably, because after the South African War, when the Hartbeespoort Dam was built, it brought quite a lot of prosperity into the region, which was otherwise very badly impoverished. But before that happened, the people who displaced Mzilikazi were the Voortrekkers. Now, they came through and they banded together and they formed an alliance with all the Botswana people who had been evicted by Mzilikazi or had voluntarily moved away because they didn't want to be subjugated by Mzilikazi. So this alliance of people drove Mzilikazi out and settled in the area in a pattern that had never been held before, because the Voortrekkers settled on fixed land. They took farms. They initiated the process of farm boundaries, And then they exploited the local people in indentured labor to work on their farms for them. So the whole pattern of society changed quite dramatically. The reason for the trek was, of course, that the voortrekkers were escaping British rule at the Cape. They didn't like being ruled under British regulations. And that caused problems right through the 19th century. And eventually, at the end of the 19th century, war was declared in the form of the Great Anglo-Boer War, now called the South African War. And the Magaliesberg became a massively important area for the war after Pretoria fell. Before Pretoria had fallen, the Boers living in the Magaliesberg area had gone to fight elsewhere along the borders of the Natal and Cape colonies. But as the British Army advanced and took Pretoria, the Boer tactics, the Boer strategy changed to one of guerrilla warfare. And that's where the Magaliesberg came into its own as a theatre of war. Because for the British, it was a barrier against which they could drive these very elusive Boer commandos that they could never catch, but they could drive them up against the Magaliesberg Mountains, where there were only a few places that the Boers could get through. And at those places, they built these fortifications, mostly blockhouses of the type that we're looking at here from above. Others were bigger, more sophisticated fortresses, but they fortified the Magaliesberg quite extensively. The Boers, on the other hand, found the Magaliesberg very convenient because although it looks like just a row of cliffs, it is actually greatly indented by those cliffs that I showed you earlier, and is a wonderful place to hide and to get away from the British. So because they were very felt-wise and they knew their way around very well, they could use this landscape quite successfully against British domination. But the farms that they had established were all burnt in the Magaliesberg. It was to prevent the Boers from using their farms or their wives and their farm laborers from supplying them with products from the farms. The British burnt almost every single farm in the Magaliesberg. So there are only one or two buildings in the Magaliesberg that post-date 1900. In other words, everything else has been burnt except for, I only know of two buildings, but I'm told there are more than that. There are probably 3 or 4 old farmhouses that are still extant. The rest were all destroyed during the war. And that, after the war, created an enormous amount of poverty. And when the British now had won the war and were governing this part of South Africa, they tried to resuscitate the economy by building big structures like the Hartbeespoort Dam. And there were lots of other projects like this. And Hartbeespoort Dam was built not only to revive the rural economy by irrigating the farms, it was also a poor relief scheme. In other words, it was a poverty alleviation scheme because white people only were employed to build the dam. And then after they had built the dam, they were allocated plots of land all over the bushveld to the north of the dam, and there they were encouraged to farm. I've just written a history of the Hartbeespoort Dam and that whole process, so I won't talk about it in the context of this book, the Cradle of Life book. But what had also changed in the Magaliesberg area was the discovery of platinum. I mentioned right at the beginning that platinum was one of the big consequences of the bushveld complex. Vast amounts of it, in fact, the biggest deposits in the world the biggest deposits of platinum exist along the northern edge of the Magaliesberg, and they are extensively mined. Science has come into the Magaliesberg in the form of, this was originally this was a satellite tracking station belonging to NASA, but it has now been converted into a radio telescope, and it is also supplying information when you drive around or hold your phone up and get navigation assistance on your phone or sat-nav system in your car. You're getting a signal from HeartRayo, this particular telescope, or some of the signals you're getting are from here. So a lot has changed. The other thing that was brought into the Magaliesberg was NEXA, the Atomic Energy Commission, that has built a place in the Magaliesberg. So the Magaliesberg is now quite a modern and scientific area where previously, before the South African War, it was very much a backwater. Those developments are good and bad, but I still treasure the fact that the Magaliesberg has still got wonderful, quiet areas where you can go and enjoy the tranquility of the landscape and the fauna and the flora that exists there. And to close this talk, I'd like to just quote John Buchan, a famous author and novelist. He later became the governor of Canada. And in one of his books, where he had visited the same gorge, the Hartbeespoort Gorge, on a moonlight night, he went there shortly after the Boer War. And he says, far up on the summit was a boulder with the likeness of an august head, an august human head. Mzilikazi, Boer commandos, British yeomanry, all had passed before those passionless eyes, and their successors shall pass and be forgotten. Because the veld and the mountains continue forever and are impartial to their human occupants. Well, that certainly was true in 1903, and I certainly hope that it remains true, that we will, that we will remain, that the velds and the mountains will remain impartial to their human occupants. So thank you for listening, and I hope that things stay beautiful in the Magaliesberg for a long time to come. I apologize for my croaky throat. Thanks, John. I think you're muted, John.
There we go. The beauties of technology. It's I'm trying to unmute. I'm like, what's going on? How come I can't unmute? Wow. I don't even know where to begin. I think it is just such an amazing story that you've put together. It's, you know, it's making us, you know, just reflection, you know, just reflecting on how life is, how it is, and I love that you focused on geology and how the landscape actually speaks to what informs human survival as we know it. So kudos to you, and thank you so much for your passion and for what you do. And there's been a lot of comments just coming in. You know, I think some of the individuals just that have joined us on the call, some of them I can't really see them properly, but XN saying absolutely fascinating summary, you know, so much history there. Thank you for sharing with us your passion. Desiree saying, thank you, Vincent, again, for bringing alive our beautiful Magaliesberg, and best wishes to from Desiree.
Thank you.
Just wishing you well. You know, Lucy, I think Lucille saying absolutely fascinating. And I think that's just the general sentiments that everybody's just, you know, saying that it's just so well put together. It's almost like you've left us on the edge of our seat, wanting and craving more. And then a very interesting comment came in a little bit earlier on from Lorraine saying hi. I think the chat was just a little bit coming up at the time, says she would like to introduce herself and mom from Cape Town. Mom grew up in the Magaliesberg in the 30s and has some interesting stories from the area. So definitely, you know, a lot of people just sharing the same sentiments and saying, you know, what a fascinating place Magaliesberg is. But Prof, let's jump in quickly with just a few questions.
Sure.
If you could
before we go, John, can I just say to Lucille, who you cited there, please ask her to drop me an email. I'd love to hear what her mother has to say about the mountains in the 1930s. That would be very fascinating. But thank you. Let's hear some questions. I'll see if I can answer them. I don't know.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. So Lorraine is, I think it's Lorraine Leach. She's still on the call. I'm hoping, Lorraine, please, I would also love to hear some of those stories. I think it's so interesting. It would be nice to just have a nice compilation. And just for the record purposes, this presentation is being recorded and it will be shared on our social media platforms. We'll be sharing it on Facebook. We'll be sharing it on our YouTube channel. So please, the conversation continues way beyond and after this presentation. So just a quick question from anonymous attendee saying hi I have seen old botanical specimen from the 1900s labeled as coming from Magaliesberg with a K, not a G. Is this an old name or a spelling mistake, perhaps?
1800s.
Oh, 1800s. Yes, yes, yes.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, John, I don't know, does it, if it ends in a Magaliesberg with a K, I haven't seen that spelling, but one should remember that during the 1800s, in the 19th century, the Magaliesberg was regarded as a region more than just the mountain range. So they would talk about the Magaliesberg region probably stretching from about just north of Potchefstroom, which was the old Boer capital, right across and north of what is now just the Magaliesberg range. So I expect that some of those specimens might come from elsewhere. But as I mentioned, the Magaliesberg draws its species from two biomes, from grassland and bushveld. So very likely those specimens would occur in the Magaliesberg mountain range or in the Magaliesberg Biosphere Reserve anyway. So I would be surprised if much of that stuff doesn't actually occur in the Magaliesberg itself. It is amazingly diverse in its species.
Wow. All right.
One of the, if I can just go back to the spelling, one of the common, oh, sorry, Jane has just brought in the suggestion the K comes at the beginning. So it's Magaliesberg.
Oh.
And I don't know what the explanation for that might be.
Mm. All right. Oh, no, thank you for that, Sir Vincent. And we've got Mr. Carr, who's just asking if you could share the title of John Buchan's book that you spoke about in the presentation. So if you've got the title of that book, that would be amazing. But while we are on that, just an interesting question here coming up on the platform saying, where is it thought that hominids developed into Homo sapiens? And why did the Middle Stone Age people return to the Magaliesberg, if there's any sort of empirical evidence on that view?
Yeah, the whole question of the process of evolution is a very, very complicated one. And it's also, because it's complicated, it is much disputed. There are different authorities have different ideas. What we do know from the Cradle of Humankind is that there were several species of hominin. Now, hominins is the word applied to the group of primates, one of which became Homo sapiens, but not all. They are the primates that left the forest and became bipedal, walked on their back legs, and some of them became extinct. Others of them have become human beings. That process is a continuous one. So there was never a moment when a mother, let's talk about the genus Australopithecus, which is the most common genus before the genus Homo. And these are called chronospecies. In other words, the whole concept of a species begins to come apart at the seams when you talk about fossils, because we know that things evolved. So there was never a time when a mother, an Australopithecine mother, gave birth to a child that was suddenly a Homo, in other words, a human. That is a gradual process. So there isn't a moment in time when they transformed. It took millions of years for that transformation to take place. But because fossils are so rare in time, you only find them one at a time, and they're spaced apart by hundreds of thousands of years. So they look very different, and so they're called a different species. But actually, the one could be, not necessarily, but could be a direct descendant of the other. And they're being given two different species names. If you had the offspring of a horse, it would look like a horse, and therefore both mother and child would be horses. But with fossils, it's a little bit different. I don't know if that gives a reasonable answer. The migrations are also subject to quite a lot of speculation. We know that probably the first hominins that left this area were not Homo sapiens. They were not human beings. They were probably Homo erectus, which is one of probably the creature that became a human later, but we don't know that for sure. But certainly Homo erectus. And Homo erectus was using stone tools of that middle Stone Age, and those tools they would have taken with them, or the skill of making those tools they would have taken with them. And then as things changed and developed, as populations increased, they migrated back. And the migration back into the Magaliesberg was not a great big exodus. It wasn't hundreds of people arriving one morning. It would have been a very gradual process of one group of people expanding in population, and the sons and daughters moved away and they started a new colony, and they would move further and they would start a new colony, and eventually they arrived in the Magaliesberg. So it's a very gradual process. Long answer to that question, but it is a very interesting question, and one there isn't simply a short answer to give.
No, I think, Master Vincent, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think what is most fascinating to me is just the understanding of Gondwana land, and yes, as it's separated into many different facets of how we understand the world to be today, and the various ways in which climate had changed, and the movement patterns of animals, and how they gradually kind of evolved, and others didn't really quite evolve. Absolutely amazing. So now, I think the question that I want to gather from you is, would you say, with the impact of global warming and how climate is changing, would you say that perhaps maybe the continuous evolution of human species as we know it is still continuing, might continue to evolve, and we might even continue to change in how and who we are currently?
Yeah, well, that of course is a very, very interesting and important question for all of us to be asking ourselves, actually, because we're pushing our luck, quite frankly. Do you know, most species that, I was talking about chrono species that are recognizably the same animal over periods of time, they usually last for several million years. Homo sapiens has only existed as a recognizable species for about 250,000 years. So we've only run a quarter of the way that we could, if we were smart, carry on doing. But we're not smart. We call ourselves sapiens, which means wise, and we're being distinctly stupid in the way we are abusing our planet. So we need to ask that question: can we save ourselves from the impact of our own abuse of our own environment? And at the moment, we're not doing very well. Now, we must at the same time flip the coin and look at the other side, and that is Homo sapiens is an extremely adaptive species. That is actually why we have spread all over the world. Most other animals don't have a distribution range like we do, which is on every single continent, with the exception of Antarctica. We have occupied everywhere. So we are extremely adaptive. So we have to do both things. We have to take better care of our environment, or else we will make it uninhabitable if we keep going the way we are. But we must also adapt, because it is changing. Things will be very different in perhaps even a century, but certainly in 1,000 years' time. This planet will look and feel, I think, very different to what it does now. And we will have had to adapt to living under those conditions. And that might be genetic adaptation. In other words, we'll have to adapt physiologically, but we'll also have to adapt technologically to handle some of the big problems that are going to be handed down to us in a world that is changing around. So we've got to change both ways. And if we don't, then we're Homo stupidus.
I love that. I think we should term that and literally coin that word and just make it specifically yours, patented, and call it Sir Vincent's words.
You're welcome to the copyright.
All right. So I have to obviously, as an expert and a scientist, and the young lady, young boy out there who's watching this presentation, or perhaps will watch this presentation in its great depth and the beautiful way in which you've summarized, our understanding of the world, and asking one question. Is there still room for archaeologists, somebody to go and study this type of science, perhaps maybe in university, for future learnings? Would you encourage anybody to get into it? And if you were to get into it, Sir Vincent, how would one then choose specializations in order to be able to do extensive or further research in this field?
Yeah, well, the answer to your first question is yes, there are fabulous opportunities in this region. Within sort of striking range of the Magaliesberg are 4 big universities, well, 5 actually, the Tshwane University of Technology, but the other 4 big ones are Pretoria University, University of the Witwatersrand, Northwest University. Those are very big institutions, and they all have very big and active archaeological departments and paleontological departments. Wits and sorry, I forgot University of Johannesburg University too. That's the other one. Joburg University and Wits have got big paleontological departments. The Wits has an institute, a research institute called the Evolutionary Studies Institute, ESI. Pretoria University has a massively important and active archaeological department. So the careers are open to anybody who is fascinated by this subject. And paleontology tends towards the, I was going to say medical, I don't mean medical, I mean anatomical, the looking at anatomies of animals and humans. Archaeology looks at artifacts. And of course, there are very active history departments in all of these areas, and they're looking at history generally, and much more modern history than I've talked about in this talk. The most recent history that is taking place in South Africa, the big changes in politics and social structure. So there are massive opportunities academically, and also in non-academic life. There are people who are being employed as consultants to property developers, and those kinds of things are changing. And I must just have a quick mention here. The property development in the Magaliesberg has always been regarded as a threat, but actually a lot of property developers are now very sensitive to the environmental and the archaeological sensitivity of the region, and they employ people like I'm talking about to help them to understand and not to do excessive damage.
Sure. Oh, I think the comments are just coming in fast and furious here on the chat, and also some questions as well. But we're able to get hold of Lorraine, who says, and I just want to get her contribution quickly. Says, my thinking just keeps going too fast.
John, if it's difficult for you, I did see her message on my screen, and she mentioned field guides as a career opportunity. And my goodness, it's so silly to omit that. I neglected to mention that. There are, as we're getting more and more tourists and people are waking up after COVID, the field guiding profession is a very important one. And I'm very, very keen, and I try where I can to help people who are becoming field guides to be good field guides, not to put out the rubbish stories, because there's a lot of nonsense that's sometimes spoken, but to get to grips with the real stories, which are actually much more interesting than the fiction, and to tell visitors and guide them constructively and informatively about this region. It is a fantastic asset, the Magaliesberg, for South African tourism. So let's use it to best advantage. And thanks very much for that reminder that field guiding is a massive thing and a very important one.
All right. Let me just take just 2-3 last questions while we have so many people on the call, and just wrap it up for the day. I think it's been absolutely amazing. Sue asking us, connecting with us and asking, what is the link to the Neanderthals in relation to the presentation that we've given today?
The link is very tenuous and distant. I mentioned the big migrations of Homo erectus that moved out of Africa and other hominins that have moved out. They moved northwards. If you remember the map that I drew, they moved north into Asia and Europe, and they evolved into other creatures. These are not human beings who evolved. These are pre-human hominins that evolved into other things. One group, one line of evolution seems to have been in Central Europe, and they evolved into Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals' distant ancestors are African. Everybody's ancestors are African, but those Neanderthals are a distant, they've of course become extinct, and they became extinct in Europe. There is no direct link between the people who live in South Africa, or in fact anywhere else on the planet, and the Neanderthals anymore. There's just that migration link that happened.
Awesome. We're doing quite good, and we're doing really good with time as well. Henley asking, are there any modern counterparts to dolomite creating bacteria? She asks this because on the farm where she resides, there is a salt stream, and this leaves behind a strange rock carbonate-like structure, almost like a sponge turned into rock. And building on to this question from Haneli is from Sherry saying, fascinating by the example of rock art. On the surface of the builder, are there no examples of rock art in caves in Magaliesberg? And why do you think that is so?
Okay, let's quickly deal with the first question. Dolomite. Yes, dolomite is being formed all of the time, and has been ever since those very initial ones that occurred in what is now the Cradle of Humankind. And I don't know where the person's farm is that she says she's seen the stream that she looks at. It looks as if it's forming dolomite. That is very likely to be going on. There are also places here and elsewhere now in the world where cyanobacteria is active and dolomite is being deposited. The point about the Magaliesberg is that this is probably where the very first of that process ever occurred on the planet. But now it is going on everywhere, and it is constant, and it's going on today. I do know that cyanobacteria has been discovered near Mandela, somewhere near Mandela City on the coast. So it's everywhere, in fact. The second question, just repeat the question for me, John. What was it about?
Rock art? The
rock art, yes. There are very few rock paintings in the Magaliesberg, just one or two. One of them, is this picture still on the screen of Olifantsneck Dam and my place? Because right next to the dam wall, there is a cave there, which is called Kruger Cave. It's not actually named after Paul Kruger, but anyway, there is a cave there, and that is one of the few places where there is rock paintings on the wall. And there is another site further towards Pretoria from this picture where there is rock art, but it's very, very limited, and it's nowhere near of the same type as the rock art that we find, for example, in the Drakensberg or in the Eastern Cape, up near the Drakensberg Mountains there, or in Lesotho, for example. So this is poor quality rock art in the painting sense of the word, but we've got fantastic rock etchings. That's our prize.
Sure. And just as a closing question, if I may put it, could there be some sort of evidence that perhaps maybe the texture of the rock back then could have somewhat been a little bit softer than what it is today, which allowed for this meticulous art carving and drawing on the rock?
Yeah, John, I don't know, because when you're talking in geological time, you're talking of billions of years, and we're talking about probably a couple of thousand years. So it is actually in geological time, in other words, in the kind of time that is required to make a rock, you're talking about very recently. And it isn't, very improbable that the rocks were structurally very different from what they are now. But leading from your question is an interesting fact, and that is that they used only one type of rock. It's a particular dolerite rock, not dolomite, dolerite rock, in other words, volcanic rock. Yeah. And it oxidizes and it forms an outer surface of a sort of terracotta, orangey brown color. The rock inside is a light gray. So I think probably what they were doing was scratching through that top patina of oxidized rock through the reddish yellow part and getting to the gray. So what they would have had was a very pretty gray picture on a red rock. And that is because the patina is indeed a bit softer than the inner core. So you're right in that sense, yes.
Sure. So Vincent, this has been an absolute fascinating and well put together presentation, full of information and the wealth of knowledge. Wow, what an amazing presentation. This has been absolutely amazing. So you mentioned, just also in closing, you mentioned that there will be a conference of some sort coming up. It will be one of the first of its kind in South Africa. Can you tell us just a little bit about that date and whether you'd be participating specifically on the conference as well?
Yes, indeed. It's not the first of its kind. It is the Heritage Association of South Africa, HASA, has a conference every year, and they move it. They have it in a different town, usually in a place that is of heritage interest. So last year was in Swellendam, for example, and they've had it in Tulbagh, and they've had it all over the country. And for this time, it'll be the first time in the Magaliesberg, and that will make it a very different type of heritage conference. And what we've got is, in the course of a 3-day conference, it runs from the 13th of October until the 15th. We've got 15 different speakers speaking on different topics. Some of them the kind of thing that I've been talking about, but they'll be going into more depth or more up-to-date information maybe. All of them very prominent historians or archaeologists or whatever discipline they are. They're from a cross-section of disciplines. And there will also be outings. During the course of the 3 days, we will take people out to visit heritage sites in the Magaliesberg. So it's going to be a wonderful event. The venue is the cableway. We have a cable. I know you guys have got a bigger cableway than we've got. We've got a cableway that goes up the mountain, and the cableway has a conference center associated with it. And it will be held in the cableway conference center, and people will be able to go up to the top of the mountain as well and see the whole spectrum of what essentially what I've been talking about today. So it'll be a fun event, and they can get hold of me or perhaps through the Heritage Association. It's got a website, and book for the conference, and everybody would be very welcome to come along. I think it's going to be very interesting. It's not designed for high-powered science. It's for ordinary interested people. So I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy it.
Sure. Absolutely amazing. Sir Vincent, let me wrap it up also just by giving a quick shout out. Let me start with you in particular. Thank you so much for your passion. We absolutely love your work. We love listening to you. Your presentations are always so amazing. What you're seeing in front of you right now is the books that are available. And they will be on discount for the next 2 weeks until we have our next Wednesday talk. We will have a little bit of a break. I think the next Wednesday talk will be on the 7th of September. If I'm not mistaken, it will be the week after. But that will be verified on different social media platforms that we'll be having. All those books that you see in front of you, ladies and gentlemen, Cradle of Life, Wildlife and Frogs of Southern Africa will be on discount. And in fact, it gives me great honor and great pleasure to also introduce the gentleman that you see in front of your screen, who's fiddling with something over there. This is Mr. Greg. Mr. Greg, please open up your mic because we want to hear from you. We have a very special announcement. Firstly, the announcement is on the gentleman that you see in front of your screen, Mr. Greg Donnelly. He is the Botanical Society bookshop manager stationed at Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden. He is the beautiful face that you see every time you go to Kirstenbosch to purchase these amazing books that you often have on offer. This particular books that you've got, he's got them on stock, and he'll be so happy to welcome all of you to say, please get yourself a copy and use that discount if you use the promo, the promo word of this particular talk. So another second important thing is that Greg will be assisting us by taking over the presentations of this talk. He will be on the seat introducing all the amazing speakers that we often have on our Wednesday talk. And from my side, this will be my final talk of the Wednesday presentations, as I will be moving on in my journey, joining another company. So I'll be leaving Senbi, but definitely not leaving Senbi spiritually and in my heart, only physically. I'll often join in some of the talks also virtually and just listen to the amazing presentation. So in 30 seconds or 15 seconds, Greg, please say hello to everybody that is still on the call. And yeah, over to you, Mr. Greg.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much, and all the best on your travels. We hopefully will see you in the gardens a lot more. But thank you so much for the kind introduction, and special thanks to Vincent as well for a fascinating talk. Just remember that you can get discounts on those books for the next week, so it doesn't have to all be done today, but we'll keep the books aside. Just let us know. You can tell us via email. You can send it direct through the site. So I'm really looking forward to hosting these talks with Belinda and Strake, and John, you've left a big shoes to fill, so I hope that I can do these talks justice.
Mr. Greg, everybody, Mr. Vincent, in 15 seconds, let's wrap it up while we still have a whole lot of people on the line.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, John, for hosting this, and welcome, Greg, to the new job. I look forward to seeing all sorts of interesting speakers come up on this platform, which I think is a very good one. But and thanks to Belinda, who sits quietly in the background sorting everything out. I think you do a wonderful job as a team, and I'm very grateful indeed for your having invited me to be here. So thanks very much indeed. And cheers to everybody who's been listening and watching. It's been wonderful to have had all those people with us. Thank you.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, Master Greg and Sir Vincent on the same screen together. This is going to be absolutely amazing. I hope that Greg will have an opportunity to also share some of his passions. He's an avid musician. He's an avid reader. He is highly friendly and somebody that you definitely want to go and just see on a daily basis. So I'm really excited about this because of he's going to bring an amazing value to this platform, being able to have access to this amazing books that he often has on his store, at his store, and will be promoting as well. So I'm really excited about this. I don't think we could have done any better. I think this is just the top of the cream. So Greg, thank you for accepting the responsibility, and I think you're gonna do amazing, and I'm excited about it. So ladies and gentlemen, that is it from my side. Let me take this opportunity once more just to thank our partners who make this possible. Room to Grow, without you would not be able to do this on a daily basis. Absolutely, thank you. Thank you for this amazing partnership. We hope that the partnership will continue to grow in its strength. Thanks to Strake, Belinda and the team working behind the scene, just doing an absolute amazing work, making sure that technically everything is sound, that we're able to achieve the best speaking platform or presentation platform that we can ever do. Strake also does amazing work of just spreading the word and creating a digital library where we have amazing presentations like this stored digitally so that future generations can also have access to this. So Sir Vincent, This presentation will stay on for as long as the internet ceases to exist. And many individuals will share on these amazing presentations that you've had today. So thank you very much to you.
Thank you, John. You've been giving me a knighthood, which I don't have, but it's very kind of you. But thank you very much for referring to me as sir all the way through. But it's been great, and it's been absolutely wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. It's an honor that you absolutely deserve, and we absolutely appreciate your passion and the passion that you've shared with us. Let me also thank Kathy Abbott. I don't know how she does it. She is just relentless in her pursuit of excellence. And she goes out of her way to make sure all of us, she cracks the whip on all of us, Greg included, he knows about it, Belinda, and everybody that's working in putting this together. So a special thank you to Kathy Abbott for making all of this possible. Without you and your support, we wouldn't be able to, to passionately do what we do. So thank you, Kathy, for all that you do. We really appreciate you. May you stay strong so that you can continue to serve this amazing platform. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John. This is it. Signing out for the very last time. Thank you, everybody that have stayed so long to listen to us rant about different stuff. It's been an absolute amazing Wednesday, and we look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday when we introduce another speaker. So from myself, Greg, and Sir Vincent, we'd like to say have a fantastic week ahead and have a great weekend. Enjoy spring, go out and explore. Remember to protect the environment that you live in. Thank you, everybody. Until we meet again next time. Ciao.